Hello again. One of the things which I have observed with growing dismay over the last few years is the increasing use of pseudoscience in anthropology and indeed archaeology, which is invariably used to back up tendentious claims about history. This takes several forms, but the one I want to talk about today is called craniotomy, which basically just means measuring the skull. This is similar in many ways to phrenology, feeling the bumps of someone's head, and it's about as reliable as well. It's based upon the idea that different races have distinctively shaped skulls and faces, so that some are longer and some are broader and more round and so on, and that it's possible to establish what somebody looked like in life just from examining a skull. Black people, those from East Asia, and white people from Europe all supposedly have different proportions when you carefully measure their heads. Now, I happen to have here a human skull, and the top's neatly sawn off, which makes my life a lot easier now. If I do the following, I'll measure the widest part here. I hope you can all see what I'm doing. That's the breadth. Now, if I multiply that number by 100, and then I measure the longest part of the skull here, and divide that large number I've just had by multiplying the breadth by 100 by this new number. And that will give me what's called a cephalic index. Now I can work out the race of the skull and therefore the likely colour of the skin which this person had in life. Is that clear? The next question is, does that sound likely? Or does that sound like a load of pseudo-scientific nonsense? Well, it was really, really popular with the Nazis, of course. They used to measure noses and heads and all sorts of things to work out who was a Slav and who was Aryan and all the rest of it. That didn't work out too well. There are very few pure racial groups to be found anywhere in the world, and certainly hardly any at all in Europe or North America or Africa. The DNA of the average African American is about 20% white European. And many white Americans also have black ancestry. I've got black ancestry. Another thing to bear in mind is that the shape of children's skulls often are different from the parents' skulls. So diet and environment have a bearing on the shape of a skull as well as ethnicity. In Europe, ancestry is so jumbled up it's almost impossible to draw any conclusions at all about ethnicity simply from measuring a person's skull. All of which makes it enormously difficult to say anything with confidence about the appearance in life of somebody whose skull one is measuring if you have no other information about the individual. In other words, I could never in a million years work out if this skull belonged to a Chinese person, someone from India, an African, or a white European. It can't be done. This has not stopped those determined to pretend that Britain has always been home to a large number of people from Africa from putting forward outrageous claims about how they have discovered that this or that person was African. We have seen this done with the so-called ivory bangle lady from Roman York and the beachy head woman in Sussex. In both cases, reconstructions have been undertaken which show them to be black. The latest use of craniotomy was in the examination of skeletons from the Tudor warship, the Mary Rose. This led to claims that the crew were ethnically diverse. In the case of the ivory bangle lady, beachy head woman and the sailor from the Mary Rose, a particular computer program was used. They didn't just measure the skulls, they took complex measurements of the face and various features. For example, the width across the nostrils is supposed to be different in black people from white, so are the eye sockets and so on. Okay, you put them through the Fordisc program, which was designed incidentally to aid forensic work when a skeleton is discovered and people want to know the ethnicity. Obviously, if you're a policeman, then it's possible to state reliably whether the skeleton of an unknown murder victim belonged to a black person or white or someone from East Asia or a person of mixed black and white ancestry. This would be of great use to a police force investigating an historic murder. The team looking at the skulls from the Mary Rose used Fordisc, and they said the following. Craniometrics were analysed via Fordisc, which compares individual samples with known recent skeletal populations. Samples were compared with black, Hispanic and white males from the forensic data bank. Posterior probabilities, which estimate group affinity based on relative distance and assumes affinity to one reference group, and typicality property, I don't know what I mean by typicality probability, chi-square, which gives a likelihood of group affinity based on the absolute distance of the sample from the group centroid, are reported alongside group affinity estimates. Morphoscopic analysis followed decision tree and optimized sum scores attributes methods. The skeletal populations these methods are based on are also recent. Therefore, interpretation was conducted with an understanding of the historical colonial framework which led to these collections and the ancestry classifications they use. Gosh, it all sounds really up to date and scientific, doesn't it? Surely we should just trust the science here. Or should we? What percentage of skeletons can be identified accurately as to their ethnic origins using this program? Do you think it's 90%? 80%? 50%? A study was undertaken of the efficacy of Fordisc and the results published in a peer-reviewed journal. I give a reference for this in the description to this video. Using Fordisc other than within very specific parameters is all but useless. Even within those parameters, in optimal circumstances, it's only successful in one case in 100 in divining the correct ethnicity of a skull. One need only read a study which ran 200 skeletons of known ancestry through Fordisc program and then collated the results. The findings are damning. This is what the abstract of the report had to say. The results of the analyses suggest that Fordisc's utility in research and medico-legal contexts is limited. Fordisc will only return a correct ancestry attribution when an unidentified specimen is more or less complete and belongs to one of the populations represented in the program's reference samples. Even then, Fordisc can be expected to classify no more than 1% of specimens with confidence. So in other words, they looked at 200 skeletons that they knew the ethnicity of, and Fordisc managed to identify only 2 of them. That's 1 in 100. As I say, this was really, really popular in Nazi Germany. They turned it into a big science, but of course it's not science at all. It's pseudoscience. It's useless. It's Nazi racial science, and that really tells you pretty much all you need to know about craniotomy in general and Fordisc in particular. The archaeologists who carried out the work on the Mary Rose's crew knew all this perfectly well, which is why they hedged their conclusions around with so many caveats and reservations. They know that Fordisc is useless, and yet they still use it to pretend that Britain's past was ethnically diverse. In other words, they are cheats who are trying to put one over on us. It was only by reading the original report that I was able to see the trick which had been pulled here. The newspaper headlines and articles were thoroughly misleading and dishonest. The pseudoscience of Nazi racial theory is now being used as the Nazis used it for political purposes rather than anything even remotely scientific. The other thing which is quite shocking and makes this whole business even more devious is the way in which the teams which wrote up the research project concealed their political aims behind supposed science. They talked at length about isotopes in tooth enamel and how this was measured, and a host of other difficult processes that most of us know nothing about and have to take on trust. Actually identifying somebody as having African ancestry, though, the thing which made the newspaper headline, did not rely upon science at all, but guesswork. First, they used a program which has a 1% success rate in working out the ethnicity of skeletons, and then, to back up the claims, they fell back to describing a leather wrist guard which the skeleton was wearing when found, which bore the image of a pomegranate. This led them to say that pomegranates were associated with the Moors in the medieval and early periods as a fruit they had brought to Europe from Africa, and was also a symbol used for Catherine of Aragon's branch of the English royal family. This is sheer guesswork with no scientific justification at all. But note how cunningly this is slipped in. There's a lot of complicated stuff that only a scientist could make sense of, followed by the real reason that they think the skeleton might be from North Africa, because of the bracelet. This is all fairly typical for this kind of stunt these days.